In October 1886, winds from the Bitterroot Mountains swept down into the Mercy Fork Valley nearly 3 weeks early. Not hard at first. Not with the full violence the Bitterroot Mountains were capable of. Just cold enough to change the smell of the air. Cold enough to make horses restless in their stalls at night. Cold enough that thin ice formed along the north side of water barrels 3 weeks before anybody in Mercy Fork believed winter had the right to arrive. Hiram Voss stood in the yard behind the relief house at dawn, watching frost cling to the northern face of the fence posts, while the southern side still sat wet with mud. Beside him, Brindle refused to lie near the north wall. The old shepherd hound paced once, nose low, then settled against the opposite side of the building with his ears pulled tight against his head. Hiram noticed that before he noticed the wind chime. The metal strips hanging beside the kitchen door were ringing softly. Not from the west, from the mountains. People gathered after breakfast when Hiram warned them the snow would come early and stay late. He spoke plainly. Double the firewood. Salt more meat. Reinforce the roofs before the heavy storms arrived. Reverend Amos Cale dismissed him in front of the crowd. He called fear a sickness that spread faster than weather. Lenora Fitch, the hard-faced woman running the relief house, did not raise her voice when she spoke. She simply said the relief house could not afford panic, while supplies were already thin. That night, she told Hiram to be gone before sunrise. The door closed behind him after midnight, with a hard wooden sound that carried across the frozen yard. Hiram stood there, a long moment, holding Elias Voss's weather ledger beneath one arm. The black iron key rested cold in his coat pocket. The old hatchet hung at his side. Brindle stood beside him, facing north toward the dark mountains. The dog never looked back at Mercy Fork once. Years earlier, before Mercy Fork began calling him a liar, Hiram Voss had learned winter from his dead uncle, Elias Voss, a mountain trapper and telegraph repairman who spent more time in the Bitterroots than in town. Elias trusted patterns more than superstition. He taught Hiram to study. Snow clinging to pine bark, water moving beneath ice, heavy spruce resin before hard freezes, smoke flattening low before storms, and elk leaving the high ridges too early. Every sign went into a weather ledger wrapped in oilcloth. Men forget, Elias used to say. The ground doesn't. One autumn evening, he pressed young Hiram's hand against a slab of basalt, still warm after sunset. Stone keeps heat longer than people. A few weeks later, the freight road through Cutter Pass froze, shut exactly where Elias predicted it would. Remembering his uncle's teachings, by the first week of October, Hiram had already filled 12 pages of Elias Voss's ledger. Elk were moving lower through the timber far too early. Thin rims of ice formed along the creek before sunrise, then stayed longer each morning. Crows crossed the valley in the wrong direction. Even the wind smelled different. Dry, sharp, like snow blowing down from Canada before the storms themselves arrived. Despite everyone's attitude, Hiram still tried to warn Mercy Fork one more time. Double the wood piles. Store more flour. Brace the supply shed roof before the heavy snow came. Most people listened without answering. Reverend Amos Cale finally spoke outside the chapel steps while smoke drifted low across the road behind him. Hiram Voss has spent too many winters alone in the mountains, he said, long enough to forget how to trust the Lord. A few men laughed quietly after that. Later the same afternoon, Grady Bell, the heavy-set owner of Mercy Fork's supply room, refused to sell Hiram extra lamp oil or salt pork from the shelves behind the counter. Not feeding panic this year, he muttered. As Hiram stepped outside, a freight driver tightening harness straps beside the road mentioned that the North Lake already carried a skin of ice near the shoreline. Too early. Nobody answered him. Nobody looked directly at Hiram when he walked away through the freezing mud. That evening, the temperature dropped hard enough for the muddy wagon ruts outside the relief house to stiffen before dark. Milo Trent, the lame boy who helped sweep the kitchen ash each morning, slipped out the back door carrying half a dry biscuit wrapped in cloth. He crouched beside Brindle near the woodshed and fed the old dog in tiny pieces so nobody inside would notice. Brindle took the food gently from his hand. A little later, While lantern light moved behind the frosted windows, Milo pulled an old folding knife from his coat pocket and tried to hand it to Hiram. "It was my paws," he whispered. Hiram closed the boy's fingers back around it. "Keep the only thing that still belongs to you." Before Milo could answer, the back door opened. Lenora Fitch stepped into the cold, carrying a lamp in one hand. Her face hardened the moment she saw the boy outside. She grabbed Milo by the shoulder in front of the other children gathering near the doorway. Brindle moved immediately. The dog stepped between them with his head low and his body rigid, not growling, just standing there. For a second, nobody spoke. Then Milo looked up at Hiram and asked quietly, "If you're right, what happens to us?" Hiram never answered him. Hiram Voss left Mercy Fork before sunrise, with Brindle trotting behind him through the frozen dark. The valley still slept beneath thin chimney smoke and weak lantern light. Frost covered the wagon road like sifted flour. Somewhere behind the buildings, a loose sheet of tin kept slamming softly in the wind. Elias Voss had once written a single direction inside the weather ledger: "Find the place where black stone grows out of the mountain." So Hiram headed west toward the Bitterroots. By noon, the wind strengthened. Fine snow began moving across the ground in thin gray streaks long before any real storm clouds arrived. The cold was dry enough to split the skin across Hiram's knuckles until blood marked the handle of his hatchet. Near dusk, he stopped beside a ridge of exposed rock and noticed something wrong. Snow was gathering along the southern face of the basalt instead of the north. The wind had begun circling. A hard winter wind. That night, Brindle refused to sleep apart from him. The old dog pressed tightly against Hiram's back beneath the blankets, lifting his head every few minutes to test the darkness with his nose. By the second day, the mountains had started stripping strength from him one piece at a time. The cold turned the bread in Hiram's pack stiff as wood by morning, then damp and sour by afternoon after it thawed beneath his coat. His hands shook badly enough that he struggled to strike a match beside the rocks where he stopped to rest. Brindle finally grabbed his sleeve with his teeth and pulled until Hiram sat down. For the first time in years, he opened Elias Voss's weather ledger. Between pages filled with temperatures, snowfall marks, and wind directions, rested a folded piece of oil paper. The handwriting was unmistakable. "If you're reading this, Mercy Fork finally did what I always feared it would." Below that, Elias had drawn a rough map toward the western ridges, toward the black basalt cliffs. Another line waited beneath it: "Don't argue with people unwilling to look at snow." Hiram stared at the words for a long time, while the wind moved through the timber above him like distant water. Late on the third afternoon, Hiram found the cliff Elias had marked in the ledger. Black basalt rose out of the mountainside like burned iron. Snow clung to the cracks in thin white lines, while the wind screamed across the ridge above. Half hidden beneath the stone sat a narrow wooden door nearly swallowed by brush and drifting snow. The lock had frozen solid. Hiram forced the black iron key into it with both hands until the metal finally gave way with a deep cracking sound. Inside, the darkness swallowed everything. But there was no wind. That was the first thing he noticed. No moving air. No knife-edge cold cutting through his coat. Only stillness. Farther in, beyond the smell of wet stone and old ash, came something stranger. Warmth. Weak. Barely there. But real. A narrow stream moved quietly along one wall without a trace of ice. Brindle walked past Hiram into the shadows, circled once near a dry slab of rock, then laid down with a long, slow breath. Near the stream, Hiram found letters carved into the basalt. EV 1871. He pressed his hand against the mark Alias had cut there years earlier. For the first time since leaving Mercy Fork, he sat down without once looking back toward the valley. The cave kept the wind out, but that alone would not keep a man alive through a bitterroot winter. So Hiram began working. Each morning he climbed back into the timber above the basalt ridge and dragged dead lodgepole pine down the slope one length at a time. By the third trip, his shoulders burned badly enough that he could barely lift the hatchet. Brindle followed silently behind him through the thin snow, stopping now and then to listen toward the mountains. Inside the cave, Hiram built a rough wall near the entrance using willow lattice packed with clay and horsehair. Heavy basalt slabs formed the lower base, where damp air gathered closest to the floor. The work moved slowly. Clay froze inside the bucket if he left it too long near the doorway. At night, he tried building the first hearth beneath a narrow crack in the ceiling Elias had once used for smoke. The fire failed almost immediately. Smoke rolled backward into the cave instead of rising. Wet heat spread along the stone ceiling in dark patches. Within minutes, Brindle started coughing hard enough to stumble away from the fire pit. Hiram killed the flames with dirt and ash. For a long while, he sat alone in the smoke, holding Elias's ledger open across his knees while cold air crept slowly back through the cave entrance. Then he remembered something Elias once taught him beside an old trapper cabin near Lost Horse Creek. Smoke did not climb toward openings. It climbed toward pressure. The next morning, Hiram lit a candle and moved it slowly around the unfinished hearth. Near the ceiling crack, the flame bent sideways instead of upward. The smoke shelf sat too low. He had trapped the draft against itself. By dark, he tore half the stonework apart and started over. Clay covered his hands. Blood opened again across his knuckles. Brindle kept coughing each time smoke drifted low. Finally, Hiram dragged the dog down beside the lower basalt floor near the underground stream, where the air remained cleaner. Brindle pressed weakly against his leg, while smoke rolled through the dark above them. The next 2 days disappeared into work. Hiram rebuilt the hearth from the ground up. Flat shale slabs raised the firebed higher off the cave floor, where cold air settled thickest. He bent an old sheet of tin over the flames to form a crude smoke shelf, then widened a narrow crack in the basalt using a pry bar and the back of his hatchet. The sound carried deep through the mountain, metal striking stone, stone breaking apart inch by inch, wind screaming outside the cave mouth, while sparks drifted through the dark. By sunset on the second evening, his hands had swollen so badly he could barely close them. Still, he lit the fire again. At first, the flames only flickered low against the shale. Then the draft caught. Smoke pulled upward in a thin, steady stream toward the ceiling crack instead of rolling back into the room. Hiram grabbed the candle and moved it slowly around the hearth. The flame barely trembled. Outside, the wind hammered the ridge hard enough to shake loose snow from the pines. Inside, the smoke kept rising cleanly through the stone. An hour later, the wet patches along the ceiling had already begun drying. Brindle stood from the cold side of the cave, sniffed the air once, then crossed quietly toward the warmer basalt wall near the fire. The old dog circled twice before settling down with a long, tired groan. That was how Hiram knew the system was finally working. Not from the fire, not from the smoke, from where the dog chose to sleep. Late that night, for the first time since leaving Mercy Fork, Hiram laid down beside the hearth without resting the hatchet across his chest. 3 mornings later, somebody saw the smoke. Not from Mercy Fork. The valley sat too low beneath the ridges to notice the thin gray line slipping out through the basalt crack. But high above the western slope, an old mountain scout named Asa Morrow spotted it while checking trap lines along the timber edge. No campfire smoke climbed that steadily in winter wind. By afternoon, Brindle lifted his head near the cave entrance and went completely still. The dog did not bark. That worried Hiram more than barking would have. Brindle stepped in front of the doorway instead, nose raised toward the air outside, while snow drifted sideways across the rocks. Then the footsteps came, slow, careful, heavy enough to belong to an older man carrying weight. Hiram met him outside with the hatchet in one hand. "Rifle goes into the snow," he said. Then 15 steps back. The stranger obeyed without argument. Only after the rifle rested on the ground did Hiram notice the man staring at the carved handle of the hatchet. The old scout narrowed his eyes. Elias Voss carried that mark. For a long moment, neither man spoke while the wind moved through the pines above them. Finally, Asa looked toward the cave. "He pulled me into this place after the avalanche of 71, he said quietly. "Kept me alive in there 18 days while the mountain buried half the ridge." Brindle walked forward then and sniffed the old man's gloves once before backing away. That seemed good enough for Hiram. Inside the cave, Asa stood near the hearth watching the smoke disappear cleanly through the stone crack overhead. A faint smile crossed his weather-cut face. "Elias didn't prepare this cave," he murmured. "He prepared a place where weather couldn't argue with a man." For several seconds the old scout kept staring into the fire. Then he added even more softly, "That old fool's still repairing lives after death." Asa Morrow stayed 4 days in the basalt cave before the next storm reached the ridge. The old scout taught without speeches. He taught by working. Hardwood burned slower than pine and held coals longer through the night. Bedding needed empty air beneath it, or ground moisture would crawl upward into blankets by morning. Fresh hides had to dry beside moving heat instead of direct flame, or mildew would rot them from the inside. Outside the entrance, Asa spread gravel across the muddy ground to stop meltwater from creeping back into the cave. "Most winter shelters fail from wet before cold," he said once, while hammering frozen stone loose with a pry bar. For a while the system held. Then the temperature collapsed. The cold came fast after midnight. Wind struck the mountain hard enough to shake dust from the ceiling cracks. Thin moisture gathered along the lower basalt overhead, then froze into pale sheets of ice before dawn. By morning, the blankets felt damp again. Brindle abandoned his usual sleeping place beside the warm wall and moved closer to the entrance where the air stayed drier. That frightened Hiram immediately. The cave was breathing wrong again. He spent the rest of the night digging a narrow vent trench beside the smoke channel while cold air rolled across the floor around his knees. Clay packed beneath his fingernails. Meltwater soaked through his sleeves. More than once he stopped just to watch the candle flame and study how the draft moved through the room. Near sunrise, the change finally came. The ceiling stone began drying again. Moisture thinned along the walls. Brindle crossed the cave slowly, circled near the hearth, and laid back down in the old spot beside the basalt. Asa watched Hiram work through the entire night without sleep. The old scout gave a small, tired nod. "Elias used to fight shelters the same way," he said quietly. "Never trusted a roof until it failed once." A week after Asa left the ridge, Hiram began expanding the wood storage deeper into the cave. That was when he noticed the soil. Near the underground stream, beneath a shelf of basalt, one narrow strip of earth stayed soft no matter how cold the nights became. Steam did not rise from it. The warmth was quieter than that. Deep, steady, like heat trapped far below the mountain. Hiram tested it carefully. He mixed fireplace ash into the dark soil to loosen it. Old tin food boxes became shallow planting trays. From the bottom of Elias Voss's supply sack, he found onion tops, mountain cress, and turnip seeds wrapped inside faded cloth. The first attempt failed. Too much moisture gathered beneath the trays. Several seeds rotted before sprouting. Thin white fungus spread along the edges of the soil like frost. So Hiram changed the system again. He raised the trays onto flat, dry stones above the damp ground and cut a narrow vent crack into the basalt overhead to move the wet air away. Then he waited. 2 weeks passed. Outside, November buried the western ridges beneath snow. Wind hammered the mountain day and night. Inside the cave, Brindle slept beside the warm earth while tiny green shoots finally pushed through the dark soil. Hiram crouched beside them for a long time without moving. The first leaf trembled slightly in the heat rising from beneath the stone. He touched it once with the back of his finger, but he did not pick it. The first blizzard of December arrived after dark. Wind slammed across the basalt ridge hard enough to shake dust from the ceiling cracks. Snow hissed against the outer wall in long, dry waves. Even inside the cave, the air carried the deep pressure of a mountain storm settling over the range. Brindle reacted first. The old dog rose from beside the hearth with the fur along his spine standing high before any sound reached the door. A low growl rolled through his chest while he stared into the darkness near the entrance. Then came the footsteps. Slow, even, deliberate, not the stumbling rhythm of a freezing man. Hiram heard breathing next. Too controlled, too steady. A fist struck the outer door. "Help!" the voice shouted through the storm. "Man's freezing out here." Hiram did not move toward the latch. Neither did Brindle. Another knock came harder this time. Then a heavy oak branch slammed against the doorframe. The clay and horsehair wall shuddered but held. "My father died because of Elias Voss," the man outside suddenly yelled. "That thief stole freight meant for winter camps." Hiram recognized the voice, then Cal Rucker. "The thief stole freight meant for the winter camps?" Snow pushed beneath the lower edge of the doorway, while another impact struck the wood. Hiram stepped closer to the entrance, holding the hatchet low at his side. "If you hit that door one more time," he said calmly, "the cold outside won't be the most dangerous thing waiting for you." Silence followed. For one long second, only the storm spoke. Then a rifle cracked from somewhere high along the ridge. The sound slammed through the mountainside like splitting timber. Cal backed away immediately. Hiram heard boots sliding across snow and loose rock before the storm swallowed him again. Asa Morrow had reached the ridge above the cave. Only after the footsteps disappeared did Hiram finally kneel beside Brindle. The dog was trembling violently. Not from cold, from fear. Asa Morrow entered the cave a few minutes later carrying snow across his shoulders and rifle smoke on his coat. His hands shook while removing the gloves. He sat quietly by the hearth for a long time before finally speaking. Hadn't fired near a man in years. Brindle settled down between them with his head resting across his paws. Asa admitted the mountain wars never fully left him. Neither did the winters afterward. Too many frozen camps, too many bodies found after spring thaw. Men survived storms only to carry the cold inside themselves for decades. Hiram looked toward the cave entrance where snow kept blowing past the cracks in pale ribbons. The storm outside did not hate anyone. It did not remember names. It did not hold grudges. It only did what winter had always done. People were the ones who carried bitterness across seasons. Asa rubbed his trembling hands together near the fire. "The storm don't remember who you are," he said quietly. "People do." A week later, Asa Morrow arrived through knee-deep snow carrying a folded scrap of paper inside his coat. The storm had buried most of the lower trail by then. Ice hung from the old scout's beard, while Brindle circled once around him before returning to the hearth. "Milo sent it," Asa said. Hiram unfolded the note carefully beside the fire. The writing leaned unevenly across the page. Children at the relief house had started coughing through the nights. Flour barrels were nearly empty. Lenora Fitch measured soup 1 spoon at a time now. Some people still called Hiram Voss a liar whenever his name came up near the chapel stove. Then came the last line. "I still believe you." For a long while, Hiram said nothing. Behind him, near the underground stream, the first mountain crests had finally grown thick enough to harvest. Small green leaves pushed upward beneath the black basalt, while warm moisture drifted faintly through the cave. Brindle wandered over and sniffed the plants curiously. Hiram cut the first handful with slow, careful movements. He did not eat any of it. Instead, he wrapped the green leaves inside a clean cloth and placed them beside Milo's letter near the fire. The storms grew worse after mid-December. Snow buried fence lines across Mercy Fork until only the upper rails remained visible above the drifts. Chimneys smoked day and night. Children coughed through the dark hours, while wagon roads disappeared beneath frozen, wind-blown crust. Then, one evening, Clara Bell, Grady Bell's younger sister from the south edge of Mercy Fork, stumbled out of the storm carrying her feverish son wrapped in blankets against her chest. Her son could barely breathe. The sound coming from the child's lungs was thin and wet, like air moving through water. Hiram pulled them inside without questions. Snow melted across the basalt floor while Clara lowered the boy beside the hearth. She never apologized for how Mercy Fork had treated him. She never tried explaining why she had come. Instead, she quietly removed the wet wool scarf from around her son's neck and laid it beside the warm stones near the fire. Then she noticed the green plants growing beneath the black rock wall. For several seconds, she simply stared at them. Fresh leaves, in winter. Tears slipped silently down her face before she turned away. Hiram said nothing about it. He boiled water in the iron kettle and added willow bark, spruce tips, and dried mullein from Elias Voss's old supply bundles. Steam filled the cave with the sharp smell of pine and bitter wood. The boy breathed the vapor slowly beneath a blanket, while Brindle laid himself close against the child's feet. After nearly an hour, the hard rattle inside the boy's chest began easing little by little. Clara noticed it immediately. So did Hiram. Before dawn, while the storm groaned outside the basalt ridge, Hiram wrapped several handfuls of mountain cress inside cloth for her to carry home. "Don't tell them about the greens yet," he said quietly. "They won't believe that part first." Clara rested her hand against the warm stone wall beside the hearth before leaving. The look on her face made it clear. She still could not fully believe it either. The following Sunday, the wind struck the chapel windows hard enough to rattle the old glass during Reverend Amos Cale's sermon. Cold crept through the floorboards, despite the iron stove glowing near the front pews. Every few minutes, somebody in the congregation coughed. Usually more than one. Amos stood behind the pulpit with both hands resting on the Bible. "People have begun climbing into those mountains," he said, "trusting stone and hidden places instead of the Lord's provision." Nobody answered him. Snow hissed softly against the chapel walls. Then Clara Bell stood up. For several seconds, the entire room stayed still. Clara rarely spoke in public, even before winter tightened around Mercy Fork. Her gloves looked damp from the walk into town. "My boy slept through the night," she said quietly. The room remained silent. Clara swallowed once before continuing. "First full night in 3 weeks. No speech followed after that. No dramatic plea, just those few words hanging in the cold air, while everyone inside the chapel remembered the coughing that carried through the settlement after dark." Then another bench creaked. Grady Bell stood slowly near the back wall, with his hat turning nervously between his hands. "I should have stored more flour before the roads closed," he admitted. "Voss warned me." Nobody mocked him either. Outside, the storm pressed against the windows again with a low, moaning sound. Amos Cale looked down at the open Bible in front of him. His jaw tightened once. The chapel waited for him to continue preaching. Instead, he slowly closed the book. The sound echoed louder than anyone expected inside the frozen room. By mid-January, the mountain storms had become constant. Snow buried the lower half of the cave entrance overnight more than once. Wind carved hard white drifts across the basalt ridge until the entire mountainside looked frozen in motion. That was why Hiram almost failed to see Lenora Fitch collapsed near the outer wall. Brindle found her first. The old dog stopped suddenly beside the drifted entrance and gave a low, uncertain whine, but refused to move closer. Lenora's hands had already turned gray with cold. Hiram dragged her inside and wrapped heated blankets around her beside the hearth while melted snow dripped steadily from her boots onto the stone floor. For a long time, she could barely hold the tin cup he pressed into her hands. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded smaller than he remembered. "My mother healed people during the fever years," she said. The fire cracked softly between them. She knew roots, tea bark, lung sickness. Lenora stared into the coals while speaking. Then, children started dying anyway. Outside the cave, wind groaned through the rocks. The town blamed her because frightened people always need someone standing close enough to touch. Hiram said nothing. Lenora slowly reached into her coat and removed an old brass compass darkened with age, Elias Voss's compass. "I kept this after he died," she admitted quietly. "Not because I hated him, because I knew what happens to people who understand things others don't." Her hands trembled harder after that. "I thought if Mercy Fork pushed you away early enough, maybe they wouldn't destroy you completely later." The cave remained silent except for the wind and the low shifting sound of coals beneath the shale. Hearth. Hiram took the compass from her carefully. Then he placed it back beside her hand near the warm stone without another word. Hours later, exhaustion finally pulled Lenora asleep beside the fire. Only then did Brindle slowly cross the cave and lower his head across her feet. By the first week of February, Mercy Fork had stopped pretending winter might still loosen its grip. The stage road vanished completely beneath drifting snow. Men probing ahead with fence poles, could no longer tell where the road ended and the frozen creek began. The flour barrels inside Grady Bell's storage shed ran nearly empty. At the relief house, children burned with fever beneath thin blankets while soup kettles grew weaker each night. Then the supply roof collapsed. The sound carried across the valley before dawn like a cannon shot. Wet snow and broken beams buried half the remaining grain beneath splintered timber. By noon, the town understood something nobody wanted to say aloud. Mercy Fork would not survive the rest of winter alone. So Grady Bell gathered a sled team. Reverend Amos Cale came too, along with 3 other men from the valley. They tied ropes across their shoulders and dragged firewood, empty sacks, and tools uphill through snow deep enough to swallow their knees. The climb took most of the day. Wind tore across the ridge without mercy. Twice the sled rolled sideways into drifts hard enough to nearly pull the men off their feet. Frost gathered white across Amos Cale's beard until his face looked carved from salt. Then, near sunset, they finally saw the smoke. Thin, steady, rising cleanly from the basalt ridge into the frozen air. Not the smoke of desperation, the smoke of control. Hiram opened the outer door before they knocked. Warmth rolled outward immediately. Not furnace heat, not comfort. Something stranger than that. Stable heat. Dry heat. The kind built carefully and defended day after day against weather trying to kill it. Inside the cave, the basalt walls still held warmth from the hearth. Strips of venison hung curing above the smoke shelf. Gravel near the entrance remained mostly dry despite the snow packed outside. Near the underground stream, green plants pushed upward beneath black stone. Mountain cress, turnip greens, onion tops. Brindle slept beside the hearth without even lifting his head at first. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The men simply stood there, breathing steam into the warm cave air while snow melted slowly from their coats onto the basalt floor. No one said Hiram Voss had been right. No one needed to anymore. The proof surrounded them. The reinforced smoke draft, the dry bedding, the stored meat, the warm stone, the living green plants in the dead center of winter. Grady Bell finally lowered his eyes first. Amos Cale removed the bundle of firewood from his shoulder and placed it quietly beside the wall near the hearth. He never looked directly at Hiram while doing it. Hiram Voss remained inside the basalt cave for the rest of his life. What began as a shelter slowly became something larger. Over the following years, he expanded the place one careful section at a time. A small timber sleeping room rose near the warmer side of the ridge wall. Stone-lined water basins collected clean runoff from spring thaw. Drying racks for venison and elk meat hung above improved smoke channels that carried heat through the cave without filling it with soot. Old freight crates became bookshelves. Elias Voss's weather ledgers filled one entire wall by the time Hiram's beard turned white. People started climbing the ridge from valleys far beyond Mercy Fork. Ranch hands, trappers, widows trying to keep children alive through hard winters. They came to learn practical things. How to stop bedding from trapping ground moisture, how to stack firewood so snow could not rot the lower rows, how to read wind patterns against ridge stone, how to notice winter before winter announced itself. Milo Trent grew older too. The lame boy from the relief house eventually became the keeper of Mercy Fork's weather ledger. Every autumn, he walked the valley roads recording frost depth, creek ice, snowfall direction, and elk movement exactly the way Elias once taught Hiram. And every winter, thin smoke still rose from the basalt ridge. By then, Brindle had grown old enough that his muzzle turned nearly white. Most evenings, the dog slept beside Hiram's chair, near the hearth exactly as he had during that first winter inside the cave. Outside, the bitterroot wind still came down hard across the mountains. Storms still buried roads, cold still killed careless men. Snow still ignored prayers. But Mercy Fork had changed. The people there finally understood that weather was not cruelty. It was language. And for the first time in its history, someone had taught the valley how to listen. Do you think Mercy Fork would have survived that winter if Hiram Voss had stayed silent about the early snow?